"You're out by Friday," his father said, and the words landed on the dinner table like a receipt already paid in full. The chandelier above cast a soft amber glow across polished oak, steam rising from plates no one was touching anymore, and Ethan Walker sat at the far end of the table where he had sat since high school, back straight, hands folded loosely in front of him as if this were just another routine family announcement. Robert Walker didn't raise his voice. He never had to. His authority lived in the pauses between words, in the way he set his fork down before delivering a verdict. Linda Walker kept her eyes on her wine glass, the deep red surface trembling slightly as she turned it by the stem. "You're 30 years old," Robert continued evenly. "It's time to figure it out. You have until Friday." The word Friday hung in the air like a deadline stamped in red ink. Across the table, Ethan's younger brother glanced up briefly, then back down at his phone, the glow of the screen reflecting quiet relief. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't remind them that the startup had collapsed during a brutal market downturn, or that he had spent the last 2 years rebuilding in ways no one in this house had bothered to notice. Instead, he reached for his water glass, took a slow sip, and nodded once, as if accepting directions to take out the trash. The silence that followed wasn't weakness, it was calculation. 3 months earlier, in a glass office tower downtown overlooking Lake Michigan, Ethan had signed a document under bright recessed lighting while a real estate attorney slid a folder across a walnut desk. The numbers on the final page read $1,500,000, printed in clean black ink, and he had felt nothing dramatic when he signed. No surge, no grin, just the steady awareness that something permanent had shifted. That memory flickered behind his eyes now as his father pushed his chair back with a low scrape against hardwood. "We've supported you long enough," Robert said, adjusting the cuff of his tailored shirt. Supported? The word almost amused him. Supported meant the spare bedroom with faded baseball posters still pinned to the wall. Supported meant holiday conversations where his failures were dissected between bites of turkey. Supported meant watching his brother praised for promotions while his own name became shorthand for potential wasted. Ethan rose from the table without disturbing his plate. "Understood," he said quietly, his voice level, neither defensive nor apologetic. He carried his dish to the sink, rinsed it under running water, and set it carefully in the rack as though he were tidying up after a meeting. Upstairs, the hallway light hummed faintly, casting a pale stripe across family photos mounted in symmetrical frames, graduations, vacations, Christmas mornings frozen in glossy smiles. In one photo, Ethan stood slightly off-center, hands in pockets, as if already preparing to step out of frame. He entered his old bedroom and closed the door with a soft click. The room smelled faintly of detergent and dust, a space preserved in time. He opened his laptop on the narrow desk beneath the window, the screen illuminating his face in cool blue light. An email sat at the top of his inbox, time-stamped earlier that afternoon, wire transfer confirmed. Funds received. He stared at it for a moment, not with excitement, but with certainty. Downstairs, the clink of silverware resumed, the rhythm of a family convinced it had just drawn a line in the sand. Ethan closed the laptop gently and leaned back in his chair, listening to the house settle around him. Friday, his father had said, as if eviction were a punishment. But Ethan already knew something they didn't. He wasn't being forced out. He had been ready to leave long before the ultimatum ever touched the table. The house felt smaller the next morning, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the conversation and tightened overnight. Ethan woke before sunrise, the pale blue light of early dawn slipping through the blinds in narrow stripes across the carpet. For a moment he lay still, listening to the familiar sounds of pipes shifting and floorboards settling, the quiet choreography of a home that had never quite felt like his. Downstairs, he could hear his father moving through the kitchen with efficient precision, the steady rhythm of a coffee grinder, the low hum of the refrigerator door closing. Routine. Control. Order. Ethan sat up and swung his feet onto the floor, the same floor he had crossed thousands of times as a teenager with headphones on and ambitions too large for the room. On the desk beside his bed, his laptop remained closed, its dark screen reflecting a faint outline of his face. He did not need to open it again to know what waited inside his inbox. The confirmation had come through days earlier, clean and irreversible, funds transferred into an account that did not carry the Walker name on any shared statement. He dressed in silence, pulling on a charcoal sweater and dark jeans, clothing chosen not for impression but for movement. When he stepped into the hallway, he paused briefly in front of a framed photograph from his college graduation. His parents stood on either side of him in that picture, smiling wide beneath bright stadium lights, their hands resting firmly on his shoulders as if steadying something fragile. Back then, expectation had looked like pride. Now it felt more like inventory. In the kitchen, Robert sat at the head of the table reading financial news on his tablet, glasses low on his nose. Linda stood at the counter slicing fruit with careful, measured motions. No one mentioned Friday. It hovered between them anyway. Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned lightly against the counter, the aroma sharp and familiar. His father glanced up briefly. "Have you started looking?" he asked, not unkindly, but without softness. The question assumed struggle, assumed urgency, assumed dependence. Ethan met his father's gaze for a second longer than usual. "I have plans," he replied evenly. He did not elaborate. Robert nodded once, satisfied enough with the appearance of compliance. After breakfast, Ethan stepped outside into the crisp air of the quiet suburban street. The lawns were trimmed evenly, American flags hanging motionless from porches, the predictability of middle-class success lining both sides of the road. He walked past the mailbox at the end of the driveway and ran his fingers along its cool metal edge, remembering a different mailbox 3 months earlier, mounted beside a steel and glass entryway in a gated community along the northern shore of Lake Michigan. That morning had carried the scent of fresh paint and lake water drifting in from a private dock. He had stood there alone, key resting in his palm, staring at a structure of white stone and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the sky like a mirror. There had been no audience. No applause. Just paperwork signed in a quiet office and a handshake that sealed ownership. Back in the present, a delivery truck rolled past the Walker house, tires humming softly over asphalt. Ethan checked his phone. A message from his financial advisor confirmed the final details on the property tax transfer and insurance activation. Everything was in place. The house by the lake was not a dream or a projection. It was secured, insured, and waiting. He slid the phone back into his pocket and returned inside. Upstairs, he opened his closet and began sorting through his clothes with calm efficiency, separating what he would take from what he would leave behind. Each folded shirt felt less like packing and more like shedding. Downstairs, Robert's voice carried faintly through a work call, discussing quarterly returns and market forecasts, unaware that his own son's net worth had quietly shifted beyond what he imagined. Ethan zipped a small travel bag and set it by the door. Friday was still 2 days away. To his parents, it was a deadline. To him, it was simply a date already circled for departure, not because he had been told to leave, but because he had already chosen where he belonged. By Thursday night, the house carried a different kind of silence, the kind that settles in when everyone believes a lesson has already been taught. Ethan's suitcase stood upright beside his dresser, zipped and aligned with the edge of the wall as if it had always belonged there. He moved through the room slowly, not searching for forgotten items, but studying the space with a detached clarity, the pale paint, the narrow twin bed, the bookshelf still holding high school trophies that had once seemed like proof of something meaningful. He picked up one of them, a small gold-plated figure frozen mid-swing from a baseball season long past, and turned it in his hand. His father had shaken his hand that day in front of other parents, pride firm and visible. Somewhere between that handshake and this ultimatum, pride had turned into performance reviews. Downstairs, the television murmured with late-night financial commentary, numbers scrolling across the bottom of the screen in confident green and red lines. Robert's voice occasionally responded to something on the broadcast, small remarks about interest rates and market cycles, the language of control and measurable outcomes. Ethan stepped into the hallway and leaned lightly against the banister, listening. It struck him how predictable everything felt here, as if success had only one approved shape and he had once tried to mold himself to it. 3 months earlier, in a quiet conference room overlooking the city's skyline, he had sat across from 2 partners at a private investment firm, the air scented faintly with polished wood and brewed coffee. They had not seen him as a disappointment. They had seen strategy. The equity he had held quietly in a technology platform, once dismissed at family dinners as unrealistic, had matured faster than anyone anticipated. When the acquisition offer came in, the numbers did not shout, they simply arrived, structured and precise. He had reviewed them line by line, aware that a single signature would redraw his entire landscape. There had been no dramatic pause when he signed, no celebratory dinner afterward. He had walked out of the building into the crisp Chicago air, hands in his coat pockets, blending into the flow of downtown professionals as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. Back in the present, he descended the stairs and entered the living room. Linda looked up from the couch, folding a blanket with careful hands. "You will be all right," she asked softly, the question hovering between concern and resignation. Ethan offered a small nod. "I will be," he said, and there was no strain in his voice. She studied him for a moment longer, perhaps searching for fear or uncertainty, but found neither. Robert muted the television and glanced over. "Remember, this is about responsibility," he said, tone measured. "No one is trying to hurt you." Ethan met his father's eyes and saw conviction there, the belief that pressure was love in its most efficient form. He did not challenge it. He simply absorbed it, as he had absorbed countless assessments before. Later that night, in the privacy of his room, he opened his laptop once more. An image of the lake house filled the screen, captured by the real estate listing before it had been taken offline. White stone exterior, floor-to-ceiling glass, a terrace extending toward calm water that reflected the moon like brushed silver. He clicked through the closing documents stored in a secure folder, the final settlement statement stamped completed. Property tax escrow funded. Insurance active. Utilities transferred. Every detail aligned. He closed the laptop gently and sat back, letting the quiet settle around him. Down the hall, a door clicked shut, footsteps fading into sleep. Friday was less than 12 hours away now. In this house, it represented consequence. In his mind, it marked transition. He turned off the bedside lamp and lay in the darkness, not restless, not resentful. He felt something steadier than relief. He felt separation, clean and deliberate, like stepping beyond a line that had been drawn for him long ago. Tomorrow, he would walk out carrying only what he chose to keep, leaving behind more than a bedroom. He would leave behind the version of himself that had once waited for permission to be enough. Friday arrived without ceremony, pale morning light stretching across the driveway as if nothing significant were scheduled to happen. Ethan woke before his alarm, the quiet inside the house almost expectant. For a few seconds he remained still, listening to the distant sound of a shower running down the hall and the faint clink of dishes being stacked in the kitchen. Routine had not shifted. Only his position within it had. He sat up, dressed in a crisp navy button-down and dark trousers, and checked his phone. A message waited from the property management service confirming that the security system at the lake house had been activated at 6:30 that morning. Cameras online. Gates operational. Utilities fully transferred. He read the message once, then locked the screen. Downstairs, Robert stood near the kitchen island reviewing emails on his tablet, already dressed for work in a pressed suit and polished shoes. Linda moved between sink and counter, drying plates with mechanical precision. The atmosphere felt controlled, almost polite, as if everyone had agreed to treat the day like a scheduled appointment. Ethan carried his suitcase down the stairs, the wheels gliding softly over hardwood. The sound drew both of their attention. Robert looked up first. "So this is it," he said, voice steady. There was no anger in it now, only finality. Ethan set the suitcase upright beside the front door and nodded. "This is it." His tone carried neither resentment nor pleading. Linda stepped closer, hands clasped loosely in front of her. "Do you have somewhere lined up?" she asked, the question careful, almost rehearsed. Ethan met her eyes and held them gently. Yes, he said. He did not offer the address. He did not describe square footage or lake views, or the way sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling glass in the late afternoon. He simply let the certainty sit there between them. Robert folded his arms across his chest, studying his son as though searching for cracks in composure. I hope you understand why we did this, he said. Sometimes pressure is necessary. Ethan absorbed the statement without flinching. Pressure. The word felt different now. 3 months earlier, pressure had been a negotiation call at 10 at night, analysts adjusting valuation models, attorneys clarifying clauses before closing. Pressure had been watching market indicators flicker while deciding whether to hold or release equity. Compared to that, this moment felt almost weightless. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim leather key case, turning it once in his fingers before slipping it back inside. The metal inside it caught a brief glint of morning light. Robert's gaze dropped instinctively to the motion. You have a key already? He asked, a faint crease forming between his brows. Ethan gave a small, controlled smile. I do. The simplicity of the answer shifted something subtle in the room. Linda's eyes moved from the suitcase to her son's face, as if recalibrating. Is it an apartment? She ventured. Ethan paused, not to build suspense, but to choose precision. It is a house, he said. He did not elaborate further. The statement hung quietly in the air, altering proportions. Robert straightened slightly. A house, he repeated, the words measured. In his mind, houses required mortgages, approvals, years of savings. He had not considered that his son might have stepped beyond those assumptions without announcement. Ethan opened the front door, cool morning air brushing against his face. A black sport utility vehicle idled at the curb, driver waiting patiently, engine low and steady. It was not ostentatious, only deliberate. He stepped onto the porch and turned back once more. There was no dramatic farewell, no embrace forced for appearance. Thank you for letting me stay, he said calmly. It was neither sarcastic nor submissive. It was complete. Robert gave a single nod, still processing the unfamiliar calm radiating from the young man standing before him. Linda offered a soft smile that carried more uncertainty than relief. Ethan lifted his suitcase, walked down the driveway, and placed it into the rear of the vehicle. As he settled into the back seat, he glanced once at the house he had grown up in, not with bitterness, but with distance. The driver pulled away smoothly, tires rolling over asphalt toward the highway that led north along the lake. Behind him, the Walker house returned to stillness. Inside, Robert remained standing near the doorway, replaying the brief exchange in his mind, the word house echoing louder than the ultimatum he had delivered days earlier. He had expected struggle. He had expected scrambling. What he had seen instead was preparation. And somewhere between the closing door and the fading sound of the engine, it began to occur to him that Friday had not been a threat. It had been a formality. The highway stretched north in a clean gray ribbon, Lake Michigan glinting to the right like brushed steel under the late morning sun. Ethan sat quietly in the back seat as the sport utility vehicle moved past familiar exits and into neighborhoods his parents had only ever driven through on the way to charity galas or corporate retreats. The air inside the car carried a faint scent of leather and fresh linen, neutral and composed. He rested his hand lightly over the leather key case in his pocket, not for reassurance, but as acknowledgement. This was not an escape. It was a transition executed on schedule. As the vehicle exited toward the gated community along the shoreline, landscaped stone walls rose into view, understated yet unmistakable. A uniformed attendant stood beside a security kiosk framed by trimmed hedges and white flowering shrubs. The driver lowered the window and provided Ethan's name. The attendant checked a tablet, then glanced up with professional courtesy. Welcome home, Mr. Walker, he said before signaling the wrought iron gates to open. The phrase landed differently than any welcome Ethan had heard in years. Not because it was grand, but because it required no explanation. The car rolled forward slowly along a private road lined with tall oak trees, their branches arching overhead like a natural corridor. Through gaps in the trees, the lake shimmered in wide, open expanse, the water stretching toward the horizon without interruption. The house came into view gradually, first the edge of white stone against green lawn, then the full structure emerging with clean modern lines and expansive windows that reflected the sky. It stood quiet and self-assured, not extravagant, but intentional. The driver parked in the circular driveway, and for a moment Ethan remained seated, observing the symmetry of the architecture. The way sunlight slid across the glass panels and settled along the terrace overlooking the water. He stepped out onto smooth stone, the air carrying a crisp hint of lake breeze. The front door, crafted from dark walnut with brushed steel accents, felt solid beneath his palm as he unlocked it. Inside, the foyer opened into a wide living space with ceilings rising nearly 20 feet, natural light pouring in from the rear wall of windows. The floors were pale oak, the scent of new finish still lingering faintly. There was no furniture yet, only open space and quiet. His footsteps echoed softly as he walked toward the glass wall facing the lake. Beyond it, a private stretch of shoreline curved gently, the water calm and steady. He stood there for several seconds, hands in his pockets, absorbing the stillness. No one here knew him as a disappointment. No one here had framed him by past attempts. The house did not carry history, it offered scale. His phone vibrated lightly. A notification from his bank confirmed final escrow reconciliation. Another from the utility company confirmed activation of high-speed internet and energy services. Everything aligned precisely as planned. He set his suitcase near the staircase and walked back outside, noticing a small delivery van turning into the driveway. Two men stepped out, carrying modular furniture pieces scheduled to arrive that afternoon. Ethan greeted them with a polite nod and brief instructions about placement. He did not boast about ownership. He simply directed the arrangement of his own space. As the day progressed, sunlight shifted across the interior, warming the floors and casting long reflections along the walls. By early afternoon, a sectional sofa faced the lake, a dining table stood centered beneath a minimalist light fixture, and a king-size bed frame rested in the upstairs primary suite. Each addition transformed the structure into something lived in. He walked onto the terrace and leaned against the railing, looking back at the glass facade that now reflected not just sky, but movement inside. Somewhere 50 miles south, his father would likely be at his office reviewing quarterly reports, unaware that his son was standing in a fully owned property valued at $1.5 million, not renting, not negotiating, not asking permission. Ethan exhaled slowly, the lake breeze steady against his face. This was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about no longer needing to be measured by the standards of a house he had already outgrown. The first night in the house unfolded without noise, without ceremony, only the low rhythm of water brushing against the shoreline beyond the glass. Ethan stood in the upstairs primary suite as twilight softened the horizon into muted shades of blue and silver. The room was spacious but uncluttered, a king-size bed centered against a pale wall, a single lamp casting warm light over newly assembled nightstands. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lake reflected the last trace of sunlight like a quiet promise. He loosened the collar of his shirt and walked slowly toward the balcony doors, sliding them open just enough to let the evening air drift inside. It carried a clean scent of water and distant pine, a contrast to the conditioned stillness of the house he had left behind. He did not feel triumphant. He felt aligned. Downstairs, the living room lights glowed softly against empty walls now partially furnished, the sectional facing outward toward the horizon rather than inward toward a television. He descended the staircase, footsteps steady against oak floors, and paused at the edge of the open kitchen. Stainless steel appliances reflected subtle shapes in brushed metal, untouched and waiting. He opened the refrigerator, stocked earlier by a concierge service, and poured a glass of water. The simple act felt different here, not because of luxury, but because it required no explanation to anyone. His phone vibrated on the counter. A text message from his mother appeared on the screen. "We hope you are settled. Let us know if you need anything." The wording was careful, balanced between pride and uncertainty. He read it twice before typing a brief reply. I am settled. Thank you. No elaboration. No address. He placed the phone face down and walked toward the terrace again, stepping outside barefoot onto cool stone. The night had deepened, stars faintly visible above the wide expanse of water. In the distance, small lights from boats shimmered gently. He rested his hands on the railing and allowed the quiet to stretch around him. 50 miles south, in a suburban home shaped by predictability, his father would likely be reviewing spreadsheets or preparing for another day defined by measurable outcomes. Here, metrics felt less urgent. Here, space itself was the statement. He thought back to the first time he had visited this property with a real estate agent. The agent had spoken in practiced tones about appreciation rates and architectural pedigree, but Ethan had barely listened. What had held his attention was the silence between sentences, the way the house did not demand performance. It did not ask who he had failed to become. It simply offered room. Inside again, he walked through each space deliberately, touching the edge of the dining table, adjusting the alignment of a chair, turning off unnecessary lights. Ownership revealed itself in small gestures, in the way he could rearrange without consultation. He climbed the staircase once more and entered the bedroom, leaving the balcony doors slightly open so the sound of water could drift through the night. As he lay down, he stared at the ceiling for several seconds, not restless, not replaying arguments. Instead, he considered how quiet preparation had altered the outcome long before confrontation ever occurred. Friday had arrived and passed without spectacle. No raised voices. No declarations. Only distance created by intention. He closed his eyes as the steady rhythm of the lake filled the room, aware that what had shifted was not merely his address, but the axis on which his life had been measured. He had not left in anger. He had moved forward in certainty. And in that certainty, there was a calm that required no audience. Monday morning arrived with a pale wash of light spreading across the lake, the surface rippling in steady patterns beneath a clear Midwestern sky. Ethan stood in the kitchen of his new home, dressed in a tailored gray suit, reviewing a digital agenda on his tablet while coffee brewed quietly behind him. The house had begun to feel lived in, not because of decoration, but because of rhythm. Deliveries had come and gone over the weekend, artwork had been mounted along the hallway walls, and the echo that once lingered in the living room had softened under the weight of furniture and intention. His phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for a downtown meeting with senior partners from the firm that had acquired his equity stake. It would be the first time he attended in person since the acquisition finalized. He glanced once at the lake through the glass wall before turning toward the garage, where a dark blue luxury sedan waited under recessed lighting. The drive south into Chicago carried a different tone now. Instead of blending into traffic unnoticed, he entered the city with clarity, aware that he was no longer negotiating entry into rooms that questioned his credibility. When he arrived at the high-rise office building, valet attendants greeted him with professional courtesy. Inside, the lobby stretched upward with marble floors and brushed steel columns reflecting morning light. A familiar partner, Daniel Reeves, approached with an extended hand and a restrained smile. Good to finally have you here, Daniel said. Your timing on that exit was impressive. Ethan returned the handshake with equal steadiness. It was the right moment, he replied. No boasting, no dramatics. Just fact. In the conference room overlooking the Chicago River, financial projections filled large screens while executives discussed expansion strategies and future investments. Ethan listened more than he spoke, offering measured insight when necessary, his voice calm and precise. Across the polished table, several board members regarded him differently than they had months before. Not as a young founder who had taken a risk, but as a stakeholder whose decisions carried weight. Meanwhile, 50 miles away, Robert Walker sat in his own office reviewing quarterly reports. During a break between calls, a colleague mentioned a recent acquisition involving a technology platform Robert vaguely recognized. That company had a young founder from around here, the colleague said casually. Made a strong exit. Robert paused, fingers hovering over his keyboard. Walker, the colleague added. Ethan Walker, I believe. The name landed with quiet force. Robert's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He opened a browser window and searched the acquisition details. Numbers appeared on the screen, valuation estimates circulating through business publications. He read carefully, the realization settling in layers. Back in the conference room downtown, Ethan concluded the meeting by outlining a potential investment initiative that would expand the firm's portfolio into emerging digital infrastructure. Heads nodded. Notes were taken. No one questioned whether he belonged at the table. When the session adjourned, Daniel walked with him toward the elevator. You should consider joining the advisory board formally, Daniel suggested. Your perspective is valuable. Ethan considered the offer briefly before nodding. I will think about it. As he stepped into the elevator alone, the mirrored walls reflected a version of himself unburdened by expectation. The car descended smoothly toward the lobby. Outside, the city pulsed with midday energy, taxis moving in steady lines, professionals crossing intersections with purpose. His phone vibrated again. This time it was a text from his father. Call me when you have a minute. The message was short, devoid of instruction. Ethan read it without reaction, sliding the phone back into his pocket. He walked toward his car, the skyline towering above him, aware that the distance between where he stood and where he had been measured no longer required confrontation. It required time. And time, unlike approval, was something he now controlled. That evening, as the sun lowered over the Chicago skyline, Ethan finally pulled his car to the side of Lake Shore Drive and returned his father's call. The city moved around him in steady currents of headlights and reflected glass, but inside the vehicle there was only stillness. Robert answered on the second ring. I read something today, he began, skipping greeting and small talk. His tone carried a restraint that had not existed a week earlier. About an acquisition. Your name was mentioned. Ethan rested his hand on the steering wheel, eyes forward. Yes, he said simply. There was no attempt to dramatize the confirmation. On the other end of the line, there was a brief pause, the faint sound of paper shifting. The valuation listed was significant, Robert continued, carefully choosing each word. You did not say anything. Ethan considered the statement before replying. There was nothing to say, he answered. The truth of it was not defiant. He had not withheld information out of spite. He had simply stopped seeking validation before acting. Silence followed again, longer this time. In his office miles away, Robert stared at figures printed across financial reports that now felt incomplete. He had measured success in quarterly increments, in predictable promotions and stable trajectories. What unsettled him was not the number itself, but the realization that his son had moved beyond his understanding without resistance or announcement. Are you comfortable? Robert asked finally, the word awkward in his mouth. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly toward the lake beyond the buildings, its dark surface reflecting scattered city lights. I am, he replied. I bought a place along the North Shore. He did not state the price. He did not describe the square footage or the view from the terrace. He did not need to. The information Robert had already seen filled in the rest. There was another pause, but this one felt different. Not confrontational. Recalibrating. You should have told us, Robert said quietly. Ethan exhaled slowly. You told me I needed to figure it out, he said, voice steady. I did. The statement carried no accusation. Only completion. On the other side of the line, Robert leaned back in his chair, absorbing the shift in power not through conflict, but through absence of control. Your mother would like to see it, he said after a moment. It was not a demand. It was almost a request. Ethan considered the image of his parents stepping into the wide foyer, looking up at ceilings twice the height of their own, hearing the water move beyond glass. He imagined his father calculating angles and property lines, trying to contextualize what could no longer be dismissed as potential. You are welcome to visit, Ethan said calmly. Let me know when. There was no rush in his voice, no need to stage a reveal. The house was not a trophy. It was a boundary. The call ended without raised voices, without apology, without victory declared. As Ethan drove north toward the shoreline once more, dusk deepened into full night. When he entered the gated community, The security attendant nodded in recognition, lifting the barrier with quiet efficiency. The house stood illuminated against the dark water, interior lights casting warm reflections across the terrace. He parked in the driveway and stepped out into the cool air, listening to the steady rhythm of waves brushing against stone. Inside, he moved through the living room, turning off lights one by one until only the glow from the lake remained. His phone buzzed again with a short message from his father. "We are proud of you." The words were simple, almost restrained. Ethan read them without a surge of satisfaction. Pride, once withheld, now arrived too late to shape him. He placed the phone on the kitchen counter and walked to the window overlooking the water. He did not need the acknowledgement to stand where he stood. He had already built the distance quietly, carefully, long before anyone noticed it forming. The following Saturday afternoon arrived with clear skies and a steady breeze moving across the lake, sunlight scattering in bright fragments over the water beyond the terrace. Ethan stood in the kitchen adjusting the placement of two simple white plates on the dining table, not out of nervousness, but out of intention. A black sedan turned slowly into the circular driveway, tires pressing softly against stone. Through the wide front windows, he watched his parents step out, his father smoothing the front of his jacket as if preparing for a business meeting, his mother pausing briefly to take in the height of the facade and the sweep of glass facing the shoreline. The doorbell rang once, a clean, restrained sound that echoed lightly through the foyer. Ethan opened the door without hesitation. For a moment, no one spoke. The lake breeze drifted in behind him, carrying a faint scent of water and open air. "Come in," he said calmly, stepping aside. Linda crossed the threshold first, her eyes moving upward toward the ceiling that rose nearly 20 feet above them, then across the open living space where sunlight stretched unbroken from one end of the room to the other. Robert followed more slowly, gaze analytical, scanning the lines of the architecture, the precision of the finishes, the view framed deliberately beyond the glass. His posture remained straight, but something in his expression had shifted from authority to assessment. They walked toward the wall of windows without being prompted. The lake filled their vision, wide and steady, horizon uninterrupted. "It is beautiful," Linda said quietly, almost to herself. Ethan stood a few feet behind them, hands loosely clasped, offering no commentary. He did not describe the square footage or the market appreciation or the negotiations that had secured it. The space spoke for itself. Robert turned slightly, looking at his son in a way that no longer resembled evaluation. "You did this on your own," he said, not as a question. "Yes," Ethan replied. There was no edge in his voice, no need to emphasize independence. It was simply fact. They moved through the house slowly, the kitchen with its polished stone counters, the staircase rising in clean lines toward the second floor, the primary suite overlooking the water where balcony doors stood partially open to let in light. In the upstairs hallway, Robert paused near a window that framed the shoreline. "I thought pressure would motivate you," he said after a long silence. Ethan considered the words carefully before responding. "It did," he answered, meeting his father's eyes. "Just not in the way you expected." There was no accusation attached to the statement, only clarity. Back downstairs, they gathered around the dining table. Sunlight shifted across the wood surface, soft and warm. Linda reached for Ethan's hand briefly, her grip gentle. "We were afraid you would settle," she admitted. Ethan gave a small nod. "I did not," he said. The room fell quiet again, but it was not the tight silence of the dinner table he had left behind. This silence held recognition. Outside, the water continued its steady rhythm against the shoreline, indifferent to pride or doubt. Robert walked toward the terrace doors and stepped outside, looking back at the house from the railing. From that angle, the glass reflected all three of them standing inside, framed by light. He exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the breeze. When he turned back toward his son, there was no directive left in his posture, no deadline hidden in his tone. "You have done well," he said simply. Ethan accepted the words without leaning into them. He did not need the acknowledgement to anchor his success. As the afternoon light softened and the visit drew to a close, his parents returned to their car with measured steps, glancing once more at the structure rising quietly beside the lake. Ethan remained on the terrace after they left, watching the sedan disappear beyond the gates. The horizon stretched wide before him, steady and open. He had not argued. He had not demanded apology. He had not proven them wrong with anger. He had simply built something larger than their doubt and stepped into it. And in the calm that followed, there was nothing left to defend.